All right, I hope you're ready. We're going to do a little bit of science today. We're going to do a little poetry. We're going to do a little bit of history. We're going to do a little biblical stuff. But first, I want you to know that earlier this summer, I passed an important milestone, the 14th anniversary of my ordination to the Presbyterian ministry. I looked it up. The typical gift is ivory. And I was a little bit disappointed the presbytery didn't give me a tusk or something. But that's neither here or there. I've been up here preaching almost every week for 14 years, which is cool generally, but also was a reminder that I'm about to enter my 5th time preaching all the way through the 3-year lectionary cycle. That schedule of scripture readings many churches use on Sunday, right? That's a lot of times, actually, of talking about the same stuff up here. And maybe it seems like it can get a little boring. I would imagine that some of you may have lived through many more than that cycles of the lectionary. And maybe you've heard tales that are very similar. But I will tell you, every now and then I come across something that's just completely new to me, still now. Like this passage we just heard actually from Isaiah 51. I don't remember ever hearing this before. Have any of you? Were you like, oh yeah, that one? Isn't it cool? The Bible's so cool. It's so big and dynamic. It's just a source of constant revelation. The Spirit is good. So the background here is that this is from the second section of Isaiah. There are 3 sections of Isaiah. You don't care about that too much. This is the second section, though. And the generally accepted scholarship says this is a prophet speaking to the people of Israel in exile. Quick history refresher. We're late 6th century BCE. Israel lost its war with the Empire of Babylon. Most of its physical, governmental, and religious infrastructure was destroyed at that time, and most of its people were shipped off to live in a foreign land as a punishment. So there's not really too much to say that at this point when Isaiah is talking, everything is completely a mess. Everything is a mess, and there is no hope at all that it's going to get better. And the prophet is talking into this situation. And he says, listen up, you who want to make good of this somehow. Listen up, you who somehow want to live rightly even in this total disaster of a situation. And here's the message that he brings to the people that want to listen. Remember what you're made of. Did you hear that, what Johanna was reading? Remember what you're made of. That's what really struck me and that made me aware I had never read this passage before. Remember what you're made of. Knocked me right off my feet. It sounded like this when she read it. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, to the quarry from which you were dug. Which I think is a little beautiful. It's also a little melancholy. I've never really thought of a statue longing to return to its mountain before. Or a stone having nostalgia for its quarry. Have you ever thought about that? Some little piece of gravel on the side of your garden's I just wish I could go back to my quarry. But that's what Isaiah says. He says, remember what you're made of and let it give you strength and hope. But what are we made of? That's a question we could ask. If we had Isaiah here, we could ask. Of course, way back then in the 90s, and by that I mean the 590s BCE, Isaiah may not have known how many answers we might have to that question today of what we're made of, right? We can talk about this on a number of levels. We could talk about how we are made of bones and muscles and blood and organs and ligaments and joints and arteries and connective tissues, right? On a smaller scale, we could talk about how we're made up of living cells and their various components that we learned about in freshman biology, of which I could only really remember one, which is mitochondria. Right? We're made up of it's the powerhouse of the cell, by the way. Actually, is there something about a Golgi body in there? Is that a thing that exists too? There you go. So we're made up of cells that have these various components. On an even smaller level than that, what are we made of? On an atomic level, we could talk about how we're made up of molecules and elements like oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, calcium, phosphorus, and a few others. In fact, famous astronomer, planetary scientist, and cosmologist Carl Sagan, you know Carl Sagan, he told us to look at the little blue dot. Carl Sagan had this whole bit about how the elements inside our bodies, somewhere way back in the history of the universe, were forged inside stars, right? Maybe you've seen this on a birthday card. You are made of stars. He wrote, the nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood, the carbon in our apple pies were made in the interior of collapsing stars. We are made of star stuff. So maybe that makes you feel a little good this morning. You're made of stars. It's not even your birthday, and I'm telling you that. You're made of stars. Remember what you are made of and let it give you strength and hope. But what are we made of? Now, of course, we could come at that from a more philosophical perspective, right? We are made of our history. We are made of our ancestors. Isaiah knows this too when he draws his hearers' attention to Abraham and Sarah, their ancestors, who, though hopelessly barren, brought forth a nation through toil and doubt and success and failure and struggle and faith. We are made of what has happened before. It was a trend circulating on TikTok over the years to point out that because women's eggs are present inside their bodies at birth, that it is true that the cell that became you, follow along with me, the cell that became you was inside your grandmother when she was pregnant with your mother. You're just staring at me. Right? Are you following? The things that happened while your grandmother carried your mother could affect you. The science is a little shaky on that one. I see some scientists, I'm not going to point you out, looking at me with little skepticism. It's actually, I think, an oocyte that are in a female person's body at birth, not an ovum, but something in there is vaguely true. There was it's a metaphor. There's a cell that was there, and there's a cell that was in your mother. What we do know is that in the relatively new field of epigenetics, scientists are uncovering some fascinating possibilities about how we carry in our genes the effects of what happened to our ancestors. One set of studies, for instance, examined children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and found that they appear to carry genetic markers of the stress that their families underwent, changes to their own genetic code which continue to affect their health and well-being today, even though they themselves did not experience those things. Which means that what are you made of? You are made of your ancestors' adversities and also their ingenuities. You are made of your ancestors' traumas and their acts of resilience. Remember what you are made of and let it give you strength and hope. But now maybe that's all too sciencey for you, right? The epigenetics and the phosphorus. Maybe you didn't come to church to hear about that. Maybe you prefer to think poetically. If so, you could think about one of my favorite poems, Where I'm From, by George Ella Lyon. In it, he invites his reader to understand that he came from the many disparate elements of his childhood environment, from his physical landscape and also from his family culture and their habits and foods and drinks. Would you like to hear that poem? A couple of you would, so we're going to go with it. This is Where I'm From by George Ella Lyon. I am from clothespins, from Clorox and carbotetrachloride. I am from the dirt under the back porch, black, glistening. It tasted like beets. I am from the forsythia bush, the Dutch elm, whose long-gone limbs I remember as if they were my own. I am from fudge and eyeglasses and Imogene and Alifair. I'm from know-it-alls and pass-it-ons and from perk up and pipe down. I'm from He Restoreth My Soul, with cotton ball lambs and 10 verses I can say myself. I'm from Artemis and Billy's branch, fried corn and strong coffee, from the finger my grandfather lost to the auger, the eye my father shut to keep his sight. Under my bed was a dress box, spilling old pictures, a sift of lost faces to drift beneath my dreams. I am from those moments, snapped before I budded, leaf fall from the family tree. And I love that. I would love us all to write a poem like that for ourselves, of where we've come from. In fact, I may or may not have a handout inviting you to do that much, which I will pass out as we depart today. We're made of what we've seen and been and done and understood and touched. And we're made of what we've been told and what we've been fed and what we've lived near and what we've become. Remember what you're made of and let it fill you with strength and hope. Or maybe that's too meta for you, all this ancestry stuff. Maybe you just prefer to think on you, your very self, sitting there right now in your pew, how you are made of the choices that you've made, and that you're made of the experiences that you've had, and the joyful times you've lived to see, and the losses that you've endured. You are your survival of those things and your integration of them. You are all of them, and they are also, in a way, what has made you. What has made the wrinkles around your eyes set just so, and the scars on your skin shine. They are what has made your heart strong or timid or peaceful or restless or whatever it is. You are made up of, well, you. And I think a lot of spiritual work has to do with coming to understand what exactly that means, who exactly we are, warts and all. I think part of spiritual work means coming to see ourselves with sober judgment, as Romans invites us to do. Never I saw a more Pauline phrase than look at yourself with sober judgment. But I think a lot of spiritual work does have to do with coming to see ourselves, neither condemning too harshly or boasting too heartily, but coming to a place where the self we are bringing into relationship with God is our full self, a totally honest presentation of our many components, and finding in that honesty a sort of freedom that is the truest act of worship, and one from which we can draw strength and hope. But there's one more thing we should think about, which is that Isaiah said, "Remember the rock from which you were hewn, the quarry from which you came," which is not just an invitation, it's a statement. You were cleaved from a rock. In the imagery of Isaiah, the rock almost certainly refers to God. And actually, this section from Isaiah is one of the few places in the books of prophecy in which the author seems to be aware of the stories that we now understand as making up the book of Genesis. The story about Abraham and Sarah mentioned earlier, but also the story about how God created everything that is. The story in which we learn that we are made from God, that we are made in God's image, that you were made from God, cleaved from the rock, taken from the holy quarry, and that is the very core of what has made you. And what Isaiah is trying to say is, if you find yourself filled with longing for something you can't quite articulate, filled with a need it doesn't seem the world can meet, if you find yourself feeling as though you can't tell where hope could even come from, but for some bizarre reason still trusting that it will, then the invitation is to listen to that longing and to let it remind you what you are made of. Because the longing itself is a message. It's an indication that we are made to be unified again with the source from which we've come, the spring from which we've poured forth. The longing itself is a reminder that we are made of God, that all our physical parts came from things that came from things that came from things that God made. And that what made you is your ancestors making their way best they could through history, accompanied by God. It means that what made you is all the things in your life set against a backdrop of God's love and consistent presence with you. It's a witness that nothing you are is apart from God, and that you could not possibly be apart from God. And so if you find yourself struggling to make a way in this despairing world, or if you find yourself in exile from what you thought your life might be, or if you ever feel separated from the familiar things that brought you comfort before, then listen to Isaiah's invitation. Listen to his word of comfort to his own people and by the Spirit to us. You can draw strength and hope from knowing that the God who stretched the heavens and the God who walked through the wilderness with the people and the God who made you just as you are, broken and yet gifted with gifts this world desperately needs, that God is active even in this very moment to comfort the wasted places in our world and in our own hearts, to make a garden of the wilderness of this time and of this earth, to make sure that joy and gladness are found again, and that the new song we are learning together will one day resound with our melody of thanksgiving. Remember what you are made of, and let it give you hope. Amen. We are going to respond in song. This one you can just sing from your seats. I think it's familiar to some, new to others. We'll just sing verses 1 and 4 of song number 27.